freedom in particular. I want to thank Rabbi Saperstein, the former ambassador at large, had that job before Sam, and Katrina Lantos Sweat for their great work, which is continuing unabated, and it just is making all the difference in the world. So thank you to them. When the term genocide was created in 1944 to describe the systematic destruction of a people, its author, Raphael Lemkin, explained the term by saying, it was the sort of thing Hitler did to the Jews and the Turks did to the Armenians. On ordering the invasion of Poland in 1939, Adolf Hitler said, quote, "Who after all speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? Never again the hope and dream and the demand that the abject cruelty of the Holocaust and the systematic destruction of the Jews by the Nazis never be allowed against anyone, anytime, or anywhere, as you all know, inspired the UN Genocide Convention. Article 2 of the UN Genocide Convention clearly states, and I quote its definition, genocide means any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, and points out 5 areas: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Article 3 says even as an attempt to commit genocide or any complicity in genocide has to be punished. Communist dictatorships in the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, Cuba, Cambodia, and Ethiopia, among others, have slaughtered more than 1 million innocent people. From Sudan to the Balkans, to Ethiopia to Burma, to radical groups like Boko Haram, man's inhumanity to man knows no bounds. But then there are heroes, and there are many of them all around the world, like Chaldean Archbishop Warda of Erbil, a leader who courageously led a remnant of believers to safety and resilience, both during and after the ISIS genocide. As many of you know, China has been designated an egregious violator of religious freedom, and it's called Country of Particular Concern, or CPC, since implementation began more than 2 decades ago on Congressman Frank Wolf's historic, comprehensive, and landmark law known as the International Religious Freedom Act. Matter of fact, all of this, whether it be the Commission or the State Department's Office on Religious Freedom and the Ambassador at Large, all of it is because of the heroic work, and it had opposition, believe me, to Frank Wolf's effort, and he is the reason why that legislation is now such a landmark law. As I think many of you know, Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party have exponentially increased persecution against religious believers, including Christians. I want to do a shout out to Bob Fu, Pastor Bob Fu, for the great work that he has done. But they're also persecuting Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, ongoing, and Falun Gong practitioners in ways not seen since Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution. Now Xi Jinping, apparently fearing the power of independent religious belief as a challenge to the Communist Party's dominance, is trying to destroy or radically transform religion into the party's slave, employing a draconian policy known as synodization. Under synodization, all religions and religious believers must comport with and aggressively promote communist ideology or else. To drive home the point, religious believers of every persuasion are harassed, arrested, jailed, and tortured. Only the compliant are left relatively unscathed. Shockingly, as it prepares to host the 2022 Winter Olympic Games, China's leader Xi Jinping is committing genocide against the Uyghur Muslims and other minorities in Xinjiang. Xi Jinping's genocide includes the forced disappearances of millions of Uyghurs into concentration camps, the forced sterilization of Uyghur women, forced abortion of their precious babies, and state abduction of Uyghur children into orphanages far from home to be reared with non-Uyghur upbringing. All of this fits the definition of genocide. The Chinese Communist Party is today systematically erasing Islam in Western China, bulldozing mosques and shrines, severely throttling all religious practice, and forcing camp detainees to renounce their faith. As many of you know, leaked documents published by the New York Times and a consortium of other journalists quote Xi Jinping shamelessly pushing his genocide, saying, "Show no mercy." And they have shown no mercy. I chaired a congressional hearing on the Beijing Genocide Olympics on May 18th and argued that it's time to either move the games to another city or country or boycott. Yesterday, I chaired another congressional hearing in the Lantos Human Rights Commission, and one witness, Guzira Alayalakan, a Kazakh Muslim woman who spent over a year in a concentration camp, gave compelling testimony, eyewitness testimony, on the use of the tiger chairs, horrific instruments of torture against Uyghur and Kazakh detainees. And she also spoke, and she broke down in tears, about the systematic rape of Uyghur women by Chinese authorities. In light of what is now known, and in solidarity with the oppressed and not the oppressor, in solidarity with the victims and not the victimizer, any and all legal and ethical means of, quote, punishing, and that's the word used in the Genocide Convention, the Chinese Communist Party for the crime of genocide needs to be pursued. Thank you, and God bless you all.
My name is Nasrin Rasho, and I am a Yazidi survivor from Iraq. I grew up in the town of Talbanant in the south of Sinjar city. I lived with my parents and my siblings. My father was a farmer, and my mother is a housekeeper. We are Iraqi Yazidis that have rich traditions such as our religious celebrations in the Holy Lalish Temple. But in Iraq, religious minorities are facing many difficulties, especially the Yazidis who have still not recovered from the genocide they suffered starting in August 2014. I myself was captured by ISIS, along with thousands of other Yazidis who have been through displacement, kidnapping, torture, sexual violence, slavery, and many other crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. There are 14 of my family members who are still in captivity. This is my story.
Please welcome Nasrin Rasho.
مرحبا جميعا. اسمي نسرين رشو، ناشطة لحقوق الإنسان وعضوة في شبكة الناجيات الإيزيديات التي أسسها منظمة يزدة. وأنا أيضا ناجية قضيت قرابة سنة تحت أسر منظمة داعش. شكرا جزيلا لإتاحة الفرصة لي للمشاركة في هذه الفعالية المهمة. لقد مرت 7 سنوات هذه الإبادة التي مر بها المجتمع اليزيدي بأكمله، لكن الإبادة لا تزال مستمرة. فالمجتمع اليزيدي لا يزال يعيش في حالة يأس وفقدان أمل بالنظام والدولة والمجتمع الجواد، لكونهم يعيشون خارج أرضهم في خيام ممزقة يقتلهم برد الشتاء وحرارة الصيف التي لا ترحم. وليس هناك خطة للدولة لتسهيل العودة الآمنة لديارهم المدمرة، وتخضع مناطقنا للصراعات السياسية والعسكرية، ولا تزال القرى شبه مدمرة وخالية من أبسط وسائل الحياة الكريمة. لقد كانت نتيجة هذه الإبادة قاتلة لمجتمع صغير ومسالم مثل الإيزيديين، فأكثر من 3000 من الضحايا منذ اليوم، ما بين قتل وسبي واختطاف وتهجير أكثر من 300 ألف من المدنيين، ونتج من القتل الوحشي على أيدي داعش والمتطرفين والمجاورين. ومنذ 4 سنوات هناك غياب وازدواجية في إدارة وغياب قرار الدولة والسلطة في سنجار، إذ أصبحت مناطقنا بيد المجاميع المسلحة المختلفة ومنها الأجنبية، وكأنهم يتصارعون على جثث نسائنا وأطفالنا ورجالنا، ومعاناتنا وأرضنا وشعبنا. وكأن جرائم داعش لم تكفي، فجاء من يريد أن يكمل الجريمة بإهمال حقوقنا وتهميش وجودنا وتهجير التلاعب بنا بجروحنا ومآساتنا. وحينما نخاطب الجهات المتعددة لا نجد آذانا صاغية لمعاناتنا. الحقيقة المؤلمة أيها السادة إن 7 سنوات مرت علينا ونحن نعيش كل يوم في إبادة جديدة، فقرابة 2700 من النساء والأطفال المختطفين لا يزالون مجهولي المصير. بينما المجتمع الإيزدي يعيش بأكمله في حالة فقر وصدمة وفقدان الأمل. إن السلطة السياسية في العراق لم تجد إلى الآن برنامجا حقيقيا واحدا لمساعدة الضحايا، فليست هناك حملة جديدة للبحث ولمعرفة مصير المخطوفين والمخطوفات داخل وخارج العراق، وليست هناك خطة وطنية للعدالة الانتقالية من أجل تعويض المتضررين وتحقيق العدالة ومحاسبة المقصرين والمسؤولين عن الإبادة الإيزيدية. أيها السادة الأفاضل، إنني كناجية إيزيدية تعرضت إلى أبشع أنواع التعذيب النفسي والجسدي وأقصى درجات الاضطهاد والتنكيل والظلم التي لا يمكن أن يتخيلها العقل البشري ولا يقبلها الضمير الإنساني. اليوم أريد أن أواجهكم باسم الإنسانية والحرية والحياة، وأذكركم باسمي وباسم كافة الضحايا وعموما الإيزيديين للعمل على تحقيق العدالة ومطالبنا المشروعة من أجل تحقيق العدالة وإرجاع حقوقنا وكرامتنا وحريتنا كبشر، حيث أطالب بضرورة بناء الدولة العراقية مشروعا وطنيا للعدالة الانتقالية يتضمن بشكل صريح وواضح الاعتراف القانوني بالإبادة الإيزيدية وبقية مكونات الشعب العراقي وإنصاف الضحايا، تحقيق العدالة من خلال ملاحقة ومحاسبة عناصر داعش والموالين لهم من العراقيين. شكرا مؤسسة الحرية الدينية العالمية لدعم الأقليات المتحدة في كثير من الدول والعالم، ونتمنى من الحكومة الولايات المتحدة أن تدعم مبادرتكم الإنسانية. وشكرا.
Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Frank Wolf.
Thank you. I have seen firsthand the results of genocide. I have traveled to lands forever changed by the atrocities committed there. I've spoken with men and women who have experienced unimaginable suffering and loss. I saw it in Darfur. Ambassador Brownback and I were the first members of Congress to travel there. We came back and we urged U.S. officials to act and to call it genocide. I saw it in Bosnia. I saw a Serb-run detention facility for Bosnian Muslims. Congressman Chris Smith, one of the greatest members I ever served with, we went to Vukovar together, and weeks later it fell, and everyone that Chris and I had met with had been murdered. I saw it in Rwanda, which the U.S. and the West ignored despite the desperate pleas for help, where hundreds of thousands were murdered. I saw it in northern Iraq. I visited Nineveh Plains, and where the ISIS had committed genocide against Christians and Yazidis. Yazidi parents wept over their daughters. We just heard the previous testimony. Wept over their daughters brutally abducted by ISIS fighters. Christian leaders lamented the destruction of holy sites and the purging of entire communities from the ancient lands they had inhabited from antiquity. I saw it in Nigeria. Boko Haram has committed genocide against Christians, and there's genocidal activity by Fulani militants. A recent UN report numbered the deaths in Nigeria at 350,000 at the end of 2020, and the genocide continues. I saw it in China in my visit to Tibet, where Buddhist monks and nuns have been setting themselves on fire to protest a cultural genocide by China. In China, the government detains, harasses, and imprisons Catholic bishops and Protestant house church leaders. The Falun Gong face severe persecution, and there are continuous reports of organ harvesting. Most staggering is the campaign being waged against the Uyghur Muslim population. More than 1 million Uyghurs have been placed in detention camps. Former detainees report of torture, rape, and sterilization. There's a video that I'm sure many of you saw of hundreds of Uyghurs blindfolded and handcuffed being herded into trains. Just last month, the Washington Post, to its credit, ran an article headlined, "Chinese Surveillance Firms Build Influence in Washington with Help from Former Members of Congress," both Republican and Democrat. This company, the Chinese tech company Hikvision, is directly enabling the Chinese government in their campaign against the Uyghurs. At the same time, it is aggressively lobbying with the former aid of former members of Congress to prevent or remove U.S. government measures limiting the company's ability to do business with American companies and investors. We know the words in Ecclesiastes 4:1, which says, "Again I looked, I saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter." Power was on the side of the oppressors. Power is on the side of the money interests. Power is on the side of those controlling the narrative. Power is on the side of the corporate elites who shamelessly prioritize market access to China above all else. The lobbying efforts I described earlier are not limited to China, but other bad actors as well. Their efforts, cloaked in respectability and business as usual in Washington, are an affront to human decency. This works against everything you in this room believe in, and they block what you work for. And so what can be done? What must be done? What should be done? We need a law prohibiting former members of Congress and other high-ranking officials from representing companies and government involved with and complicit in genocide and religious persecution. Until such legislation is passed, current members of Congress should not take political contributions from such lobbyists, and nobody in the Congress or the executive branch should meet with these lobbyists. And to aid in this affront, a Religious Freedom Accountability Project should be created to serve as a clearinghouse to collect, document, and publicize religious freedom abuses and those involved in these issues. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." Are we not the friends of the persecuted? And in the 18th century, British parliamentarian Wilberforce said this to his fellow countrymen about the evils of the slave trade. He said, "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you do not know." In 2021, with technology at our fingertips and news available 24 hours a day, we cannot say that we do not know. So what remains to be seen is whether men and women of faith and others of goodwill will accept this challenge regardless of where it leads, or will we simply choose to look the other way? The stakes could not be higher. Thank you very much.
Welcome, Chairman of the Board, Barnabas Aid, John Marsh.
Good morning. On behalf of Barnabas Fund and Dr. Patrick Sikdeo, our founder, who is not able to attend today because of the COVID travel restrictions, I would like to welcome you to this session. I'm John Marsh, the chairman of the board of Barnabas Aid USA, a division of Barnabas Fund, which is a crucial ministry to the persecuted church around the world. Recently, Barnabas Aid was circulated a petition for the U.S. government to recognize the Armenian genocide, and we were very pleased that the Biden administration acknowledged the genocide. Furthering that contextual setting for this morning's topic, we are very pleased to have with us the former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo was instrumental in moving the U.S. government in the direction of acknowledging the fundamental rights of peoples affected by the loss of religious liberty, which provides an instrumental rationale for genocide. In a recent article championing these values, Mr. Pompeo stated, "There is no right more fundamental to a free society than the free practice of religion. Along with property rights, religious liberty is the cornerstone of our unalienable rights. To deny either is to lose the legitimacy of our republic." Ladies and gentlemen, Secretary Pompeo.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. This is amazing and wonderful. I want to thank you, John, for the kind introduction. I also want to thank my friend, longtime friend. He was a governor. I was just a congressman from Kansas. Now Ambassador Sam Brownback and Katrina Lantros Sweat for organizing this gathering. It's important. Thank you all for being here today. I mean that. I wouldn't have missed it for anything. We worked hard at the State Department during my 1,000 days to build out an understanding about religious freedom in the world. We created what we called the ministerials. Many of you would have attended them. These were the largest human rights events ever held at the United States Department of State. We brought people from all across the globe together to dedicate themselves to championing religious freedom, the very cause that brings you here all this morning. This summit, this gathering, this lovely, God-driven gathering is a continuation of that work. Thank you for being part of it. I'm now an unemployed former diplomat. But I still know that promoting and safeguarding religious freedom abroad was truly a cornerstone of the work that our administration did in foreign policy. And it must always be an essential element of what we do in our efforts to fight against authoritarianism around the globe. You see the demands for religious freedom even in places like Cuba as we sit here today. And I was asked to speak for just a few minutes on the subject of genocide and preventing that, and then helping nations and peoples recover from religious cleansing. This is a topic that is close to my heart as a former fifth grade Sunday school teacher, as someone who takes his faith seriously. We know this work matters to people all around the world. You know, perhaps the worst contemporary example has been, you've heard much about today. It's the oppression and killing of Uyghurs in China by the Chinese Communist Party. The State Department built an entire apparatus to get to the place where we could declare that Chinese Communists is in fact doing to the Uyghurs what we know to be genocide. It took us till nearly the end of the administration to get there, because there was lots of discussion. One doesn't make such a declaration lightly, because a declaration like this is serious. It doesn't happen often. It is not frequent, and it is not just symbolic. It is a cause for action. And I hope that the present administration will do just that and take action to stop what rivals happened in Germany in the 1930s. To date, the current administration indicated its central focus with respect to China, and indeed the rest of the world, may well be in something like climate change, relegating religious liberty to a side issue. This is unfortunate. In my view, it is foolish. And it would be a grave mistake to prioritize climate change at the expense of allowing religious oppression to fester and grow throughout the world. There is no right more fundamental to a society than the free practice of religion. We know this. We know that when governments want to oppress, this is where they begin, behind the walls of prisons. and persecuted before our very eyes in places like China, Iran, Cuba, North Korea are tens of thousands of people whose only crime was that they wanted to worship their God in their own way. No country that denies freedom, religious freedom, can ever rightly claim to be good in some other way. There's no making up for that. And no person can ever be true to any faith that believes in the dignity of human life if they do not act out of concern for those whose dignity is assailed because of their faith. It's why we worked on this so hard. It's why our principle of freedom of religion matters here at home and to the world. It's why I created the Unalienable Rights Commission to reground our foreign policy, how we talked about human rights at the Department of State. Look, in China, under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, we can all see it, we can feel it, we know these people. It's a modern day example of a government that cares so little for people's inherent freedoms and dismisses their unique dignity that it is unimaginable to most of us. Thin claims of religious extremism have been invoked by the Communist Party there to justify this oppression. You know this. You've worked in this field. There's always a reason. But the ongoing, shocking, indeed horrifying treatment of the Uyghur population being rounded up in Xinjiang province and placed into these truly Orwellian concentration camps, where the people are surveilled at all times, placed in slave labor, forced to conduct abortions and sterilization. This should strike at the heart of every human being and every American who cares or claims to care about freedom in the world. This echoes the tyranny and persecution of the peoples that they've persecuted for so long in places like Tibet, and certainly what we've seen in the past months in Hong Kong as well. And we know this, Christians throughout China continue to suffer under the CCP's rule. Congregations that are not sanctioned, approved, and monitored by the CCP are outlawed, and any scripture not approved by the party is deemed unlawful, and those who might pursue that thrown in jail. This example, the Chinese example, makes the mark for what I was asked to talk about today. It should clarify for all of us that a society that lacks regard for religious liberty will soon see all political liberties stamped out. They will disappear. And then, of course, much, much worse, things like genocide. It's that very realization that religious liberty must be carefully guarded that can help us prevent genocide from happening. It is foundational. When people lose their capacity to practice their faith, authoritarian regimes will dominate. That basic truth today is being shown in China. Our American founders understood that when nations disregard religious freedom, tyranny absolutely will soon follow. Look, ending this isn't easy. These are hard problem sets. Earlier this month, the CCP celebrated its 100th anniversary with familiar totalitarian pageantry. Displays of hardware, cheering, red-scarf youth, nationwide crackdown on dissidents to ensure that they had political security. General Secretary Xi's message to the world was simple. Any foreign force that attempts to bully, oppress, or subjugate China will find themselves on a collision course with a great wall of steel. We should be that steel. We should be that backbone. We should be that force that opposes what they're doing to these peoples in this place that is not so far from our very shores. Look, they're not easily going to relent unless we all continue. Our efforts in the Trump administration were to rally the world against this oppression. And if the world does this, if we get it right, China, and we don't coddle China, I'm confident we'll prevail. And we'll prevail not only on behalf of security around the world, but on behalf of these people that are oppressed. Look, recovery is tough. We know this. Rwanda has been on a long path, as a good example, a long path to recovery and reconciliation. But you know, the perhaps greatest model for such recovery is found with the Jewish people in the state of Israel. In the wake of the greatest genocide in human history, the world came together to restore the Jewish people's homeland in Israel. But some 75 years later, the work is still ongoing. It's in a much better place. But for example, the Jewish population is still lower today than levels before the Holocaust and may not fully recover until 2050. I was so happy today to see that the Emiratis had opened their embassy just today in Tel Aviv. A remarkable set of leaders understanding that religious freedom across all faiths, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, truly matters. Look, the Abraham Accords are but one example, but recovery from religious cleansing must be rooted in remembering that the horrible acts took place and never forgetting. We talk about not forgetting that such acts matter. It's why places like Yad Vashem in Israel and the Holocaust Museum not too far from where we're standing today remind us of the horrors of genocide. But they also remind us of the glory that the Lord is watching over us, and that recovery from genocide is absolutely necessary and possible. We've got to do the hard work. The fact that we gather here today while genocide is ongoing in China and other places around the world demonstrates that the hard work of each of you matters. And we always say, never again. Each of us does that. But when any country, including the United States, tolerates tyranny, history will repeat itself. It's why we have to continue the good work that brings you all here together today, preserving religious liberty and fighting for those religious freedoms in every single corner of the world. Thank you. I want to say thank you to each of you. Thank you for your important work protecting religious freedom. I pray each and every day for the success of your mission and the work that you do to support each other in delivering religious freedom to every human being in the world. May the Lord bless your work. I look forward to seeing you. Keep at it. We will prevail. Religious freedom matters. Thank you for everything you all do. Thanks, everyone. Thank you all. Thanks, everyone. Bless you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome to the stage, the director of the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide at United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Naomi Kikoler.
This morning, when many of us woke up, we did not have to worry if we would be allowed to enter a school, go vote, be arrested, face sexual violence, be murdered. That's not true, sadly, for many people around the world today. That's not true for the Hazara who wake up each morning wondering what their future holds, for the Uyghurs who find themselves in detention for no reason other than their identity, for the Rohingya community who continue over 1 million to live in refugee camps in Bangladesh, and who continue to hope that the US government will recognize the genocide that was committed against them. Almost 80 years after the Holocaust, we shouldn't have to be here talking about the commission of genocide. We should not be here talking about the types of horrors that my grandparents experienced. But sadly we are, because we're here as people of conscience, and we're motivated by the words that our founder at the museum, Elie Wiesel, said. Let us remember what hurts the victims most is not the cruelty of the oppressor, but the silence of the bystanders. We're here because we are not bystanders. We're here because we recognize 3 core things. 1, that genocide is a preventable crime, that through early warning and early action, we can help save lives. We recognize that by talking about the risks that religious and ethnic minorities face, we're not making a political statement. We're talking about the unique vulnerabilities that these communities face. We recognize that preventing genocide is not a boutique issue, that respecting the international religious rights of communities is not a niche issue. It's a core national security issue. Second, we also know that when we are confronted with the warning signs, when we're confronted with the crimes that are happening, we must act. That we have an array of tools, from non-coercive to coercive tools, that can help save lives. And it's not just the morally right thing to do. It is the right thing to do for so many reasons that our guests and panelists will be talking about today. Finally, we know, as people here gathered as a community of conscience, that we cannot give up. The victims and survivors are counting on us to help elevate their voices. As one of our patrons at the museum, Ben Ferenz, the last living survivor of the Nuremberg trials, has said over and over again, never, never, never give up. We have seen in the past few years cases against Nazi perpetrators close to 80 years after the commission of the genocide. For those who have experienced genocide in recent years, for those who will unfortunately, should we fail, face genocide in the future, we must stand with them for decades to come to ensure that their perpetrators are held responsible. We must stand with them to ensure that they are protected, that those who've been displaced in Iraq, the Yazidis, the Christians, the Shabak, the Sabi and Mandaeans can have a future where they are allowed to thrive and are not the victims of genocide again. On my last trip abroad before the COVID crisis, I flew to northern Iraq and to Bangladesh for the museum to meet with survivors of genocide. And what was so harrowing was that in both places, the calls that they had were the same. They called for justice, they called to not be forgotten, they called to have their experiences recognized, and they called for their basic human dignity to be recognized and respected. It's an honor to be able to join you today on behalf of the museum. I hope that as we continue to open, we will be able to welcome you all into the institution. We appreciate the commitment that you all have made to protecting religious minorities. And it is humbling to acknowledge that as I stand here today, we have now opened an exhibit at the museum on the genocide against the Rohingya. May we hopefully in future years and decades to come not have to do that. May genocide be something of the past. With that, it is my profound honor to introduce Mark Green. Ambassador Mark Green is the president of the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars. I would also like to introduce Adlai Kijan, the executive director of the Yazidi American Women's Organization. And I'd like to invite former Congressman Frank Wolf up to the stage as well. Thank you. Thank you so much. I wanted to take this opportunity to pick up on a theme that Frank touched on around what the administration can do to help prevent genocide, but also assist those who are the victims and survivors of such crimes. And Ambassador Green, you had a very unique portfolio and vantage point when you were running USAID. And you're also responsible for creating a pretty remarkable program, which was the Genocide Recovery and Persecution Response Initiative. It's responsible for allocating almost, to date, $400 million to help religious minorities in northern Iraq. A number of the changes that you also implemented within USAID have resulted in this administration also being able to allocate funds to help the Rohingya community. Can you talk a little bit about why you launched that initiative?
Well, first, it's an honor to be here, honor to be with my co-panelists, and thank you, Naomi, for the great work that you do. And it's always good to be with Frank Wolf, who is the conscience, I think, of religious freedom. He was in Congress and continues to be. So you were very kind in describing the work that we tried to do. What we wanted to do was to provide a framework, and it began with a trip, in fact, that Frank and I took 3 years ago to northern Iraq, where we had seen the victims of genocide, forced from their home, forced to flee, and quite frankly, those who were left behind were in such small numbers, we were facing the extinction of entire communities in that part of the world. And so we saw a couple of things that were important to do, but in terms of reasoning, first off, in taking on ISIS extremists, the only way that you can be said to have defeated them is to try to restore some of what they stole. And religious liberty is what they stole in that part of the world. They forcibly destroyed communities, places of worship, and entire communities, and so we felt that was a priority to take on. Also because notions of religious liberty are who we are as Americans, right? This is part of what's in our very fiber. And at USAID, we believe it's not only an American value, but it's a universal value, and therefore it needs to be part of American leadership. It is a way that we show what we stand for. You know, these days I hear a lot of people talking about how we have to counter China. And sure, and that's important, but we also have to contrast with China. We have to show what it is that we stand for, because that is powerful. That is how you reach out around the world and show the contrast and show the difference between what China and some others seek to impose and what it is that we bring. And then finally, I viewed helping to restore religious liberty and pluralism as a vaccine against authoritarianism. And so that's why it's important, not just in northern Iraq, but in so many corners of the world. You note that authoritarians, tyrants, dictators, what's the first thing that they do? They almost always go after communities of faith because they're scared to death of freedom of conscience. They're scared to death when people are able to express their relationship with their Creator. That is contrary to everything that they stand for. So we also felt it was a key part of that. And then finally, in trying to do sound development work in a place like northern Iraq, the only way that you can help to restore opportunity and hope and viability in those communities is to unlock the power of faith-based organizations. Those organizations work with people who have been left behind and so easily forgotten. When we work through them and some of those faith leaders, we're able to reach into corners, forgotten corners. And again, that's part of our mission in trying to restore some hope.
Thank you, Ambassador Green. Adelaide, you run an organization that's dedicated to helping Yazidi women, exactly the type of local organizations that are doing work on the ground that Ambassador Green was working to try to empower. Can you talk a little bit about how the Yazidi community has regarded the U.S. response to the Commission of Genocide, and what are some of the needs that you are experiencing now?
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here, and I'm honored to be here. I want to say, as a Yazidi woman, and I think I speak for all the Yazidis around the world, when on August 3rd, ISIS attacked, we all thought, talking to our family, when they went to Mountain Sinjars, and there were hundreds of thousands of Yazidis stranded on Mountain Sinjars, they would call us. And we were like, don't worry, help is on the way, the world won't stand by, let terrorists take over, kill you guys. Day 1 passed, absolutely no response, nothing. Day 2 passed, nothing. Day 3 passed, we started receiving photos and videos from our families and friends with children dying of hunger and thirst, elderly dying of the scorching heat on top of Mount Sinjar. And then next day, silent. Their phone had died, and we didn't know if they were alive or dead. Come to August 9th, all Yazidis around the world, we started demonstrating in our cities, contacting our representatives, pleading for help, begging for help to save our family. And finally, on August 9th, the US initiated the first airstrike against ISIS so they don't ascend the mountain and kill the people stranded there. The response there, it was very disappointing that it didn't come enough. But it didn't stop there. They were still stranded. Hundreds of thousands of Yazidis in that scorching heat without food and water. Thanks to the Syrian Kurdish fighters, they came and broke through ISIS lines and opened the safe corridors where hundreds of thousands of Yazidis descended the mountain into Syria after being starved for almost 9 days, into Syria, walking 12 miles in that heat, back into Kurdistan, into safe region. Next came Kocho village. It's another Yazidi village in south of Sinjar. You might know of that village because of Nadia Murad. It was under siege by ISIS until August 15. And again, we pleaded with State Department and throughout the whole world, all the Yazidis, to help them. Nothing was done. August 15, ISIS separated the men and the boys that reached puberty from the woman, and women over 45 years of age, took them, killed them, put them in 17 mass graves, and took the rest of the girls, along with Nadia Murad, to be sold as sex slaves. In January of 2016, I went and visited that site where the other woman and her mom were buried, and the skeletons were all out there. Nothing was done at that. And then we knew where hundreds of Yazidi women and children were held in schools, still in Iraq, an ISIS-held area. And we pleaded with State Department and other governments around the world, the only thing we need from you guys is to provide air cover where Yazidi fighters will go to free the woman. We just need air cover so they can safely get to the mountain. Nothing was done. From there on, ISIS loaded all the Yazidi women and children into buses, took them into Syria to be sold as sex slaves. Over 6,000 Yazidi women and children were held captive during that week and taken as sex slaves. There's still over 2,900 still unaccounted for. Only about 3,550 have returned. The response, on this August 3rd, it will be 7 years. And let me tell you, help for Yazidis came late. And even when it came, until today, it's very little. Over half of our population in Iraq, until this day, is still suffering in these tents and displaced IDP tents in Iraq and in Syria. Only about 120,000 have actually returned to Sinjar, our own homeland. We have 81 mass graves and other sites where ISIS killed Yazidi people and entire families. Out of those, only 17 have exhumed, and those are the ones in Nadia Murad's village. And I think it's because of her, plea to find rest for her family. But we still have almost 70 mass graves with entire families unaccounted for. For us to get peace as the Yazidis, we need to put our loved ones to rest. We need to do our burial rituals and find rest for our loved ones. Nothing is being done.
Thank you, Adlai.
Over 68 areas of our shrines and religious sites desecrated. Nothing has been done. Today, to add all this to it, the KRG, Kurdish Regional Government, put a blockade on Sinjar to prevent aid from reaching the Yazidis that are stranded in the mountain. I, along with other people from Yazda organization, were the first people to take aid in 2016, January of 2016, to the people that were stranded on the mountain. When we went from the families and areas that people were taking shelter in the mountain, we found survivors there, survivors that just got raped, escaped ISIS, and there's no help available to them still in their clothes that they got raped in.
Adlai, thank you so much, and I'm sorry to interrupt. I want to make sure that we can pick up on some of the themes that you talked about what needs to happen now and how to protect communities that remain at risk. Maybe just two rapid-fire questions. One, Frank, if you don't mind talking about what can Congress do today? You've got a group of people here who are ready to engage. What can they be calling for? And then finally, Ambassador Green, what was some of the most, when you think of your role in it as administrator, what was some of the hardest things you had to grapple with?
Well, I want to give credit to Vice President Pence for changing the policy, and I want to give credit to Mark. Mark Green went places, and I know where he went. He literally changed the policy. They were given all through the UN. The Yazidis were getting nothing from the UN. The Christians were getting nothing. And so Mark Green literally almost saved Christianity in the cradle of Christendom. And my request, if there's anybody from the current administration or for Samantha Power's office, talk to Mark and find out what they did, because it was working. Before that, it was just not working. One thing I think you could do, you could have a genocide caucus on Capitol Hill, bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats, bicameral, House and Senate, to almost be the warning system, the place, because right now genocide is taking place in Nigeria, whose responsibility. If everyone's responsible, no one is responsible. I think to have a genocide caucus, Republican, Democrat, and I think the Speaker would be sympathetic. The Speaker was very sympathetic in establishing the Tom Lantos Commission, but a bipartisan caucus funded that could be the early warning system, and people could have interns working there, but we need a genocide caucus.
Thank you so much for that, Frank. And it would provide a focal point for individuals like Adlai, who in the moment had to try to reach out to state. It gives them a key partner in Congress to be able to reach out to. Giving the final word to you, Ambassador Green.
Sure. So what's the toughest thing that I saw? In addition to what we saw in northern Iraq, I had in one of my first trips an opportunity to travel to central Rakhine State in Burma. I visited essentially a prison camp, captive Rohingya. And I remember meeting a family and talking to a father. All of his kids had been born in that camp. They had never left the camp during their lifetime. And he looked at me and he said, look, we don't have any teachers, so my kids can't get an education. We don't have an imam, so we're not able to worship. The only food that we have is the food that you give us. And he looked at me and he said, what do I tell my son? I got nothing, no answer to that. Flip side. So in Jordan, we saw wonderful organizations like Caritas helping refugees as they were onward to find new lives. I saw them being trained in such things as the art of mosaics. I encourage all of you in the Ronald Reagan building, in the main lobby of USAID, there is a wonderful mosaic tile that has the USAID logo from the American people, and that was done by these refugees with their new skills as a sign of appreciation. One of the most meaningful things I think we could possibly do is to support that kind of work. I also had dinner at a pizzeria with refugees who were being taught the fine art of pizza making. And I am either a glutton or an aficionado of pizza, and it wasn't bad. That was one of the highlights, and it shows what we can do when we work with faith leaders and we are responsive to the cries for help.
Thank you so much for that. I want to thank all the panelists. I'd like you to encourage you to learn more about Adlai's organization. She also mentioned the Nadia Murad Initiative, Yazda. There are other Yazidi organizations, the Free Yazidi Foundation, to understand more the acute needs that that community and other communities in northern Iraq face. And as has been mentioned, to draw attention to the ongoing plight of the Rohingya community. And I hope you all can heed the advice from Congressman Wolf around the important need to mobilize Congress and create a standing caucus for genocide prevention. Thank you, and thank you to Ambassador Brownback, Force of Nature for Good, on all of these issues, and to everyone involved in organizing the summit. Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry that was so.
What's our ETA, sir? Hey.
Heavy fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan has continued.
Every year, 200 million Christians are marginalized, beaten, tortured, or even murdered for their faith. Now, we serve this suffering group of believers through awareness, assistance, and advocacy. We work tirelessly to open the victim's prison door, to push back countries that persecute Christians. We advise and inform the U.S. government and partner organizations with real-time analysis. We give our partners access to the persecuted world. No other NGO can match our advocacy team working on religious freedom. We have 10 full-time Washington, D.C. based analysts working on persecution around the world. But the secret to our success is our indigenous staff. We have more than 50 staff around the world in various persecuted countries working on persecution. You know, in a world of rising religious restriction and hatred, ICC is the source for access to and analysis of the persecuted church.
Please welcome the Director for the Center of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, USAID, Adam Phillips.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Adam Nicholas Phillips, and I'm the Director of the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships at USAID. I'd like to begin by thanking Ambassador Brownback and his team for organizing this event around such a critical topic for development and for inviting the administration and USAID to participate. As Secretary Blinken has said earlier this year, religious freedom is a human right. It goes to the heart of what it means to be human. Above all else, this is the core work of USAID, to uphold pluralism and fiercely defend dignity for our neighbors in need around the world. I'm honored to join you today to affirm the administration's commitment to these issues and share with you how USAID is implementing this priority throughout the globe. Prior to joining USAID, I spent my career as a pastor and grassroots advocate, championing inclusion and service to and with the poor and marginalized communities. This work afforded me the privilege to forge relationships with humanitarians, activists, and development professionals across religious and political spectrums. It also offered deep insight into issues like religious freedom, from the depth of the challenges we face globally to the potential we can offer in building bipartisan solutions here at home. USAID has a role to play in offering solution-oriented approaches to these issues. Our office at USAID has its mandate from President Biden's February 14th executive order, establishing the White House Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, which promotes partnerships with religious and secular organizations to better serve people in need. As our country grapples with a global pandemic, a severe economic downturn, the scourge of systemic racism, an escalating climate crisis, and profound polarization, President Biden knows that civil society partnerships are essential to meeting such challenges. The White House Partnerships Center is led by Melissa Rogers, who serves as the office's executive director and as a senior director for faith and public policy in the White House Domestic Policy Council. I'm excited that we'll hear from Melissa later today. USAID has a demonstrated legacy on these issues, and we are committed to them because they reflect both USAID's principles and American values. USAID's Sector Council on Strategic Religious Engagement and International Religious Freedom, which I chair, will ensure agency-wide coordination and implementation of religious freedom programming, and will model the agency's unwavering support for persecuted communities around the globe. Now, I'd like to welcome USAID Administrator Samantha Power to our meeting today. Administrator Power was sworn into office as the 19th Administrator of USAID on May 3rd, 2021. Prior to joining USAID, she served as Professor of the Practice of Global Leadership and Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School, and as the William D. Zabel Professor of Practice in Human Rights at Harvard Law School. Throughout her career, Administrator Power has advocated for the marginalized and those who have been persecuted for their faith. As Special Assistant to President Barack Obama and Senior Director for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights on the National Security Council, and later as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, she prioritized efforts to combat religious persecution and was a leader in the administration on protecting freedom of religion. In her role as UN Ambassador, Administrator Power used her platform to elevate the voices of religious minorities. She called for the release of Miriam Ibrahim, a Sudanese woman sentenced to death for refusing to denounce her Christian faith, and for Sudan to repeal the laws that put her in jail in the first place. Ibrahim was ultimately freed from death row and allowed to leave Sudan in 2014. Administrator Power was also the first person to bring a young Yazidi woman named Nadia Murad to the UN. Murad's family had been almost completely wiped out by ISIS, and she had been forced into sexual slavery. Murad's testimony before the UN Security Council helped bring further attention to the genocide against the Yazidis. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Administrator Power.
Thank you, Adam, and good afternoon, everyone. It is a privilege to address you at today's inaugural summit. I want to thank Ambassador Sam Brownback and IRF Summit 2021 Committee Co-Chair Katrina Lantos Sweat for convening this multi-faith coalition to discuss an issue that defines the lives of people worldwide: religious freedom. When secured, a person's freedom to worship as they wish is a source of boundless enrichment. Today, in 56 countries around the world, people are silenced, persecuted, or subject to worse for their religious beliefs. And religious freedom overall is on the decline. 2 billion more people live in countries with high restrictions on religious freedom than just a decade ago. This gathering also comes at a time when the very technologies that were once lauded for their potential to protect human rights, from satellite imagery to mobile video capture to the internet itself, are now being used to undermine those rights and restrict religious freedom. Heinous abuses of religious freedom and broader human rights are reflected in the horrific account of repression, violence, and genocide that we heard earlier today from Tursunay Ziawadoon, but also in the account of another survivor of the People's Republic of China's brutal repression, Zamrut Dawood. Like Tursunay, Zamrut is a Uyghur woman from Xinjiang. In 2018, she was told to report to a local police station before being interrogated, shackled with a black hood over her head, and led to a detention camp where she was forced to change into prison clothes in front of male guards. The prison cell she was held in for 62 days was so crowded, the women took shifts lying down to rest. Zamrut has 3 children. She and her husband dreamed of having a 4th. After her release, she was told that she would undergo a surgical sterilization or face further detention. She chose to forego her dreams of a larger family. They want the extinction of the Uyghurs, she told the Washington Post, recalling the forced operation. Zamrut is one of millions of Uyghurs who has been detained in Chinese re-education camps, so-called, forced to recite propaganda, subjected to sexual humiliation, and often raped or forcibly sterilized as part of the Chinese government's efforts to erase Muslim culture in Xinjiang. Despite the deprivations that Zamrut and her family faced, they were, in some ways, lucky. They were granted permission to visit Zamrut's father-in-law in Pakistan, who had fallen ill, and in 2016, they sought refuge in the United States. Most Uyghurs are denied passports and monitored closely by government officials, making such an escape impossible. It is difficult and heart-wrenching for survivors like Zamrut and Tursunay to share their experiences with the world, and it is dangerous to be outspoken about the abuses endured by their people. But there is nothing more powerful and irrefutable than living testimony to show the stakes of why it is so critical for all of us to stand up on behalf of religious freedom. Central to every major religion is a yearning for connection to the divine and the sacred practices that bring us closer to it. The potential for true freedom, self-determination, and equality rests upon the ability of governments to uphold universal human rights, regardless of how their people worship or to whom they pray, whether they are Coptic Christians in Egypt, Baha'i in Iran, Rohingya Muslims in Burma, or Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia. I'm speaking to you today as a proud daughter of Dublin, Ireland, where when I was a child, the Troubles loomed nearby, and what remains a region where faith and sectarianism can divide communities that otherwise have so much else in common. I'm also proud to serve a president whose faith has guided his life in public service, who believes in that calling to serve, not to be served, a calling to promote justice, healing, and hope, and to confront hatred with good deeds. I am proud to lead an agency that is unequivocally committed to protecting religious minorities and defending human rights. The fight for international religious freedom is not just a reflection of who we are as Americans, but of strategic national importance to the United States and a key foreign policy objective. It's why I met with Tersine and other Uyghur activists in my first week as US Aid Administrator to hear directly from them about their experiences at the hands of the PRC. We know that when countries promote religious freedom and protect religious minorities, democracy is more stable. Communities are more likely to develop equitably and prosper. The rights of women and girls are more likely to be protected, and overall quality of life improves. In fact, Pew Research indicates that GDP growth rates in countries where religious restrictions and hostilities decreased grew at double the rate of countries where restrictions substantially increased. We also know that countries which stigmatize or oppress religious minorities or restrict the opportunity to worship freely are more prone to instability and conflict. A report that USAID commissioned shows a clear pattern. Denying religious freedom is associated with higher levels of social conflict and violence. In fact, countries with high government restrictions on religion are more than twice as likely to witness social conflict as those with low or no restrictions. Whether in China, Burma, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, or Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, the United States has made clear that lasting peace will require freedom of worship and access to holy sites and places of worship for people of all faiths. It is especially urgent that we address religious freedom today, as COVID-19 has given further cover to repressive regimes to abuse human rights. Governments have taken sweeping actions to control the spread of the virus, restricting in-person gatherings, including religious gatherings. Some restrictions were, of course, necessary, but the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom's annual report revealed that already marginalized religious minorities faced even greater levels of stigmatization, harassment, and discrimination, as they were often accused of causing or spreading the virus. I know that there are those who see religious freedom as first amongst rights, and others who seek to defend religious freedom, belief, and conscience as part and parcel of a comprehensive commitment to human rights. What has become even more clear in the past year is that religious freedom is only as secure as its co-equal rights. The freedom to speak freely, to assemble and associate freely, to advocate your cause to political leaders, and to live free from slavery or torture. These rights, these principles are interdependent. Religious freedom cannot exist without them, and it is our responsibility to advance them all. It remains incumbent on us all to demonstrate that democracy can only function and deliver when it includes, protects the rights, and hears the voices of all people. And because the United States is no exception, we must continue to grapple with our own legacies of inequity and oppression. Put simply, persecution or violence against communities because of their religion or belief is symptomatic of a broken system. Religious pluralism, tolerance, and freedom yield stability, security, room for sustainable development, and democratic progress. President Biden has put development on an equal footing with defense and diplomacy within America's broader foreign policy agenda to maximize our efforts in support of persecuted and marginalized communities. Each day, in coordination with our Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, dedicated development professionals at USAID respond to human rights violations, work to prevent atrocities and preserve culture, and protect religious freedom for all people. In countries with a grim history of religious violence, like Bosnia and Herzegovina, USAID facilitates dialogue among interfaith leaders and coordinates lessons in Bosnian high schools to combat prejudice and mitigate fear of the other. In Iraq and Syria, where ISIS has perpetrated genocide against Yazidis and horrible atrocities against Christians and Muslims, driving the largest and most complex humanitarian crisis of our time, We are on the ground delivering aid and support through stabilization programs in governance, essential services, and economic recovery to help religious and ethnic minorities targeted by ISIS. In Sudan, we have supported the transitional government's effort to end severe religious freedom violations. Today, Sharia law is no longer the primary source of law. A provision has been adopted to guarantee the freedom of belief and worship. And in 2020, the transitional government adopted the Fundamental Rights and Freedom Act, which repealed the apostasy law, ended flogging for blasphemy, and banned female genital mutilation. In Sri Lanka, we have worked with religious leaders to reduce religious and ethnic tensions across the country. They have formed interreligious committees to provide trainings on pluralism and diversity, transitional justice workshops, and mediation forums. In 5 years, the project has reached more than 13,000 community members and successfully mediated more than 80% of accepted cases. And in places where religious and ethnic minorities are specifically targeted, like today in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, and in the case of Rohingya Muslims in Burma, the United States is driving diplomatic outreach to push reconciliation, to promote human rights, and to promote respect for pluralism, while using our renewed engagement on the Human Rights Council to remind those responsible that the world is watching. We are also defending religious and ethnic minorities through girls' empowerment programs that promote interreligious reconciliation, anti-corruption initiatives that bolster good governance and protect minorities, and infrastructure initiatives to try to rebuild safe spaces for communities to gather and to worship. And we are rallying the international community to combat the disturbing rise in virulent and violent attacks against Jewish people. We are working forcefully to resist anti-Semitism wherever it rears its ugly head and to find and support partners to do the same. There have long been divergent approaches to advancing international religious freedom, but there is common ground in recognizing that it is a clear, distinct human right and central to the stability and peace of this world that we all share. Enshrined in the Constitution, our commitment to religious freedom and tolerance is at America's very foundation. The Biden-Harris administration is dedicated to its protection and advancement at home and around the world. Today's inaugural summit allows us to live up to that commitment, to elevate our engagement with faith leaders, to embed interfaith dialogue in our diplomatic efforts, and to bridge differences so that we can stand together against the tide of fear and violence perpetrated by those who seek to repress religious freedom. And this summit allows us to honor the role that our faith-based partners at USAID play, often the people who are closest to the communities that we serve. They don't just embrace the idea that every person has equal worth and individual dignity, regardless of their religion. They help advance that dignity in concrete ways every day. And they work to allow those communities a chance to live, love, speak, and pray freely. Going forward, we will keep standing for religious freedom around the world. We will remain humble and grateful for the freedoms we cherish here at home, and pray that through God's grace and wisdom, we have the capacity to affirm dignity and to secure freedom for more people around the world. It's been an honor to be with you. I thank you for all you're doing. Let us work together on this vital cause. Thank you so much.
Welcome back, Pam Pryor.
Okay, get those phones ready. You know, this segment of our program really you know what it does? It capsulizes it. It is our entire fight around international religious freedom. We cannot allow genocides or religious cleansings. And many groups are formed around this important topic. And if you or your organization wants to be part of the global campaign to recognize and address genocide like that of the Uyghurs, Yazidis, or Christians, then sign up to lead, join, or follow this global campaign. Text "End Genocide" to 844-403-2291. It's the same number, "End Genocide." And this time you get 2 texts. Also, it is imperative, as the Holocaust Museum reminds us, we cannot forget the past genocides. If you are interested in combating anti-Semitism, you can sign up to lead, join, or follow this global campaign. Text "End Genocide," and then for anti-Semitism, "End Anti-Semitism." That's going to take you a little bit more thumb strokes. 844-403-2291. A great segment is coming before lunch, so thank you so much.
My name is YY Nu, and I am a Rohingya Muslim from Myanmar. I grew up in the town of Butidang in Rakhine State of Myanmar with my grandma, parents, and siblings. My father worked as a school teacher for about 30 years and was elected to parliament in the 1990 election. It is a rich Rohingya tradition to live together with their parents and children as a big family, and is one we cherish so much. But in Myanmar, due to systemic persecution for decades, severe forms of marginalization and violence and genocide, Rohingya families' lives are torn apart and separated in different parts of the country or the world. So many have been killed or forcibly deported. I haven't seen my grandma for a long time and may not be able to in my entire life due to travel bans against my community. This is a severe form of harm to my family and my community. This is my story.
Please welcome YY Nu.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to speak here today. I'm very honored to be here. As we gather to discuss religious freedom, I remember and pay tribute to all victims and survivors of the past and current religious persecution. I was born and grew up in Rakhine State, which is western part of Burma, where we Rohingya have resided for generations as our native land. However, in my generation, our existence has become a crime due to our ethnicity and religion. For decades, Burmese government have denied our history, our identity, our citizenship, and deprived us of all our basic human rights, including freedom to travel, to marry, to give birth, to go to school, to conduct economic activities, or to have access to healthcare, and to practice religious activities. And the list goes on. I was born into insecurity and persecutions, and my entire life has been subjected to many forms of systemic and structural discriminations and dehumanizations, including being imprisoned for 7 years at the age of 18 as my entire family, as a Rohingya political family. Yet, I feel I am a privileged one in my community. My experience is nothing comparable to the experiences of the 1.1 million victims and survivors in Bangladesh refugee camps who had to flee during the genocidal campaign in 2017, and the daily experiences of the remaining 600,000 Rohingya in Myanmar. These survivors and victims witness the most horrific experiences, including the killing of their family members, throwing children into fire, raped thousands of women, including in front of them in most cases, and forcing them to flee their home after torching hundreds of villages. Each and every one of us is a testament to the genocide that we continue to endure every day. For decades, the Burmese military has used these brutal and divide and rule tactics of persecutions against the ethnic and religious minorities across the country. Today, the coup in Myanmar is the result of the whole failure to hold the perpetrators of these atrocity crimes, the military, accountable. Since February, the same military has been using similar tactics against all the people in Myanmar and killed over 900 people, including children and elderly, and detained over 6,000 and forced thousands more to flee from their homes. To end this human suffering, we must first recognize the problem as it is and then work on addressing root causes. For years, many civil society organizations, including my organization, Women's Peace Network, have advocated to the world about the decade-long mass atrocity crimes in Burma. But the world has not listened to us. The international community now must recognize these crimes as it is. Now is the time for the US Secretary of the State to recognize the Rohingya genocide before its 4th anniversary next month. Second, we must take concrete actions to hold violations of religious freedom accountable. I urge the US government to use the international justice mechanisms to end the military leaders' impunity, and to the US Congress to pass Burma Human Rights and Freedom Act, Burma Act at House, and the Rohingya Genocide Act immediately. Ending the military's impunity will not only help the survivors of Rohingya genocide and other civilians of Burma, but also will send a signal to other regimes around the world that their actions have consequences. Third, we must implement measures to protect the religious and ethnic minorities. We must see that the protections of the minorities and religious freedoms are connected, and that the ethnic and religious minorities are targeted in many parts of the world. History has shown repeatedly that the people in power, especially in authoritarian regimes, use the religions as the tools to sustain their power. With the global rise in authoritarianism, including in Burma, it is now more important than ever to uplift the religious minorities and act on protecting religious freedom. Finally, as a member of the persecuted minority, I believe that no one should feel to be born as a crime or persecuted based on their identity. People like us from the affected community have been doing everything within our capacity, day and night, for justice and freedom. It is up to those who are in power now to act. The world cannot fail us again. Thank you very much.
Welcome back, Summit Co-Chair Katrina Lantos Sweat.
Boy, after you listen to these incredible, powerful testimonies from YY, from Tursane earlier, I think we are all convinced of two things. First, we are most definitely on the side of the angels. And when I think about these women, their courage, their bravery, their voices, and when I think about so many of you out there in the audience who I know of the extraordinary work you are doing, I think that not only are we on the side of the angels, but we may have some angels amongst us, so thank you to all of you. So next, it is my privilege to introduce a wonderful speaker, a person who has had a tremendous impact in terms of bringing the power and passion of faith communities into collaborative partnership with government and civil society. While we rightly celebrate the wisdom of the Founding Fathers in codifying the separation of church and state, it is important to recognize that separation of these two entities does not preclude their collaboration. Indeed, one can argue that such collaboration both strengthens and enriches societies. Melissa Rogers' distinguished career as a lawyer, an academic, and civil servant has focused on the vital intersection between church and state. From 2013 to 2017, Melissa Rogers served as Executive Director of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships in the Obama administration. Now, I would venture to say that the surest sign that you've done a superb job is being asked to come back and do it a second time, which is precisely what President Biden asked Melissa to do earlier this year. In addition to returning to her previous role, she also serves as Senior Director for Faith and Public Policy in the White House Domestic Policy Council. We should all feel a great sense of confidence knowing that a person of Melissa's caliber and experience is shaping and guiding the Biden administration's efforts to ensure that faith communities are empowered to come together in cross-faith partnerships and to take an active role in our nation's civic and cultural life, a right that should be afforded to faith communities in every part of the world. We are so fortunate to have Melissa Rogers here with us today, and I'm delighted to turn the time over to her. Thank you.
Good morning. It's great to be with all of you. And thanks, Katrina, for that very kind introduction and for your leadership on these issues, including through this wonderful conference. I'd also like to thank Ambassadors Brownback and Saperstein for their distinguished teamwork on international religious freedom, including through this conference. Their collaboration across party lines is a great reminder that we can find common ground amid our differences and work together to change people's lives for the better. Thanks as well to all of you gathered here today, both virtually and in person. It's inspiring to be among so many leaders dedicated to the freedom of religion and belief for everyone, everywhere. I'm pleased and honored this morning to bring you warm greetings from President Biden. As the President has said, ensuring freedom of religion is as important now as it has ever been. This right, as you know, is enshrined in the First Amendment to our Constitution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As you know, that declaration states that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes a person's freedom to change religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. President Biden, a person of deep faith, certainly understands the importance of religious belief and practices in the lives of so many. The President has said, and I quote, "The work of protecting religious freedom for people in all faiths and none is never finished. We must be vigilant against the rising tide of targeted violence and hate at home and abroad, and work to ensure that no one feels afraid to attend a religious service, school, or community center, or walk down the street wearing the symbols of their faith. My administration," President Biden says, "will guard these cherished principles." The United States promotes religious freedom as a key part of a larger agenda to protect human rights. In addition to the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom, which I'll refer to as the IRF office, The department also has, for example, a Bureau of Democracy, Rights, and Labor, a Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, an Office of Global Women's Issues, a special envoy to advance the human rights of LGBTQI+ persons, an Office of Global Criminal Justice, and an Office to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. These offices and advisors work together and are dedicated to promoting the equal value and the infinite worth of every human being. These precious rights are interdependent. A congregation that is predominantly comprised of members of a minority race or ethnicity, for example, can't gather for worship and carry out its ministries unless it is free from both religious and racial or ethnic discrimination. And the many LGBTQ individuals who are also persons of faith cannot practice their faith freely when they are subject to laws criminalizing them for who they are. As Secretary Blinken has said, religious freedom can't be fully realized unless other human rights are respected. And when governments violate their people's right to believe and worship freely, it jeopardizes all the others. This morning, I'd like to highlight briefly a few steps the Biden-Harris administration is taking to protect and advance religious freedom for all. Let me begin with our moral obligation to protect refugees. As you know, the number of refugees and other displaced persons has reached an alarming and historic high, more than 82 million people worldwide. In response, President Biden has raised our annual refugee admissions cap to 62,500 for this fiscal year, and he plans to raise it to 125,000 next year. He has also ensured that our refugee admissions program is able to serve refugees from around the world by reestablishing regional allocations and eliminating restrictive allocation categories. Of course, governments cannot do this work alone. I run the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, as was mentioned earlier, and we work in partnership with communities of faith and conscience to welcome refugees and to advocate for their rights in all of their home countries. And we continue to be very grateful for these partnerships. The U.S. is committed to upholding its long tradition as a leader in refugee resettlement that provides a beacon of hope for persecuted people around the globe, promotes stability in regions experiencing crisis, and facilitates international collaboration to address the global refugee crisis. Also, on his first day in office, President Biden revoked orders and proclamations preventing certain individuals from entering the United States, first from primarily Muslim countries and later from largely African countries. These actions were a stain on our national conscience and inconsistent with our long history of welcoming people of all faiths and no faith at all. As President Biden said at the time, make no mistake, where there are threats to our nation, we will address them. But we will not turn our back on our values with discriminatory bans on entry into the United States. The Biden-Harris administration advocates for universal respect for religious freedom in many other ways as well. Here are a few additional snapshots. First, in January, Secretary Blinken affirmed that the People's Republic of China is committing genocide and crimes against humanity against Uyghurs and other ethnic and religious minorities in Xinjiang. In March, Canada, the European Union, the UK, and the US took coordinated action to impose sanctions on PRC officials for these human rights abuses. And at the recent G7 summit, the world's leading democracies stood united for religious freedom and against forced labor, including in Xinjiang, and committed to ensuring that global supply chains are free from the use of such labor. Our administration has translated these commitments into a series of actions imposing import and export restrictions on PRC companies for their use of forced labor from Xinjiang. In recent months, the State Department has advocated for the rights of countless individuals in China who've been subject to a widespread crackdown by the authorities against religious and ethnic minorities, including Tibetans, Falun Gong adherents, Christians, and Uyghur Muslims. We will continue to use all appropriate tools to promote accountability for those responsible for human rights and religious freedom violations and abuses in China and elsewhere. Second snapshot. Through engagement with governments and regions across 3 administrations, the State Department, including its IRF office, has advanced progress on religious freedom in Central Asia. Uzbekistan's recent positive actions, which include releasing political prisoners and revising its laws, have been well documented. Tajikistan is now set to receive the UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Religion and Belief for the first time, and recently announced plans to adopt a human rights action plan. Turkmenistan released 16 Jehovah's Witnesses conscientious objectors from prison in May, and we hope to see further reforms. Another snapshot. The U.S. has taken strong stands in support of democracy and human rights in Burma. As the Burmese military accelerated violence against civilians in the wake of the February coup, the administration provided emergency support for members of various ethnic and religious minority groups at a time when many found themselves in the military crosshairs for actions as simple as praying for peace. In 2020, the State Department again designated Burma as a country of particular concern for severe violations of religious freedom. Another snapshot. In June, the IRF office worked with our missions abroad to track the disturbing global uptick in both anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim incidents and sentiment related to the Israel-Palestine conflict, including a surge in online hate speech and tropes, vandalism of temples and mosques, and harassment and physical assaults. Also, the IRF office has maintained international momentum and enthusiasm for the ministerial to advance religious freedom. We look forward to participating in what we hope will be the first post-pandemic in-person ministerial to be hosted by the United Kingdom in London next summer. We'll look forward to seeing many of you there. And the final snapshot I want to provide is that the IRF office has, as a co-founder and an active participant in the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance, has been continuing their investment in this very important group that I know so many of you are active in. So thank you for your work there. The IRF office, even during the pandemic, has been meeting monthly with envoys representing like-minded governments to share information and coordinate religious freedom advocacy. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, this group has played crucial roles. Alliance members have advocated for governments to release all prisoners held on account of faith or belief. They've called upon governments and religious leaders to avoid language that scapegoats certain religious and belief communities. They've also urged all governments to take proactive steps to ensure that individuals in minority and religious belief communities are safe, protected, and receive health services in an equitable and non-discriminatory manner. And we've been pleased to take note that hundreds of prisoners of conscience have been released during this period of time, and governments have condemned incidents of discrimination and violence against members of vulnerable communities, showing the enduring power of this alliance, and we look forward to working closely and actively with the members of this alliance moving forward. President Biden looks forward to nominating a highly qualified ambassador at large for international religious freedom. He looks forward to doing so in the coming weeks to carry forward these and related efforts. As important as the work of governments is, Eleanor Roosevelt was correct when she said that the destiny of human rights is in the hands of all our citizens and all our communities. The United States government deeply values the role of civil society in advancing international religious freedom and human rights more broadly. Your work is vital to informing our engagement and advocacy, and you also hold us accountable for our efforts to promote the values in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You know, listening to the speakers today, and I know we've had a great day yesterday as well, it's plain. There is so much common ground on international religious freedom issues. It's inspiring, it's encouraging. There is so much good we can do together to alleviate suffering around the world, to recognize the dignity of all, and to restore hope. This is an exciting opportunity for us to work together, and President Biden and his administration looks forward to working with you to do this important work. We offer our thanks and our best wishes for you at this conference as you do this work here, and we look forward to collaborating with you in the days ahead. Thank you so much for the time to be with you today.
Welcome to the stage, Director of the Religious Freedom Center, Hudson Institute, Nina Shea.
What an inspiration this conference is. Good morning. We're now going to tackle the critical and enormous issue of refugee protection. The UNHCR reports that there are over 82 million forcibly displaced persons worldwide. Many of these displaced are from situations of conflict, insecurity, and persecution in which particular religious and ethno-religious communities are targeted with atrocities. These groups are among those most vulnerable. Even in their places of displacement, often they are marginalized, severely discriminated against, and either further victimized. In Iraq, for many years after ISIS attacked the Yazidi and Christian communities of Nineveh, UN aid failed to reach these victims. Faith-based groups, especially local faith-based groups, stepped in and showed that they can play an indispensable role in helping to identify the needs and distributing the aid. With us to discuss these issues and policy solutions are three distinguished experts. It's my honor to introduce them. Rita Stephan, USAID Regional Coordinator for Religious and Ethnic Minorities for the Middle East. Anurima Bhargava, Commissioner of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and its immediate prior chair. His Excellency, Bishop Matthew Hassan Kuka of Sokoto, Nigeria. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage. Bishop Kuka, welcome to America, welcome to Washington and to this summit. I'm going to start with you. The Nigerian Catholic Bishops' Conference, whom you are representing at this summit, has stated that Nigeria is falling apart. Despite having Africa's largest economy, there is little doubt that a state of lawlessness has taken over vast areas of the country. Please tell us a little bit about this situation and how it happened and how that affects your community, Christian community.
Well, thank you very much once again, and I really want to thank the organizers of this spectacular event. Let me say that what the bishops of Nigeria, the Catholic Bishops' Conference said merely resonated the sentiments across Nigeria, and you really don't even have to be living in Nigeria to know the existential threat to our common humanity and unity that has been our lot in the last few years. The good news is that Nigeria has had, for the first time in its history, 5 back-to-back elections, thus showing very clearly that Nigerians themselves have decided to embrace democracy. Unfortunately for us, in the last 6 years or so of the Buhari administration, we had hoped, that this government will be able to build on some of the opportunities. And I can say, for example, that the chairman of the party on which the president rode to power is a communion-receiving Catholic. The director of his campaign is also a communion-receiving Catholic. These are people that I know pretty well. So right across the board, there was massive support for this, for the administration. And we had hoped that given the president's antecedents, it would be possible for him to build and deal very quickly with issues of national cohesion, fighting corruption, and then unifying the country. Unfortunately, the policies of government focusing on nepotism, obviously and very clearly favoring Muslims by way of the appointments, suddenly led us to where we are now, which is that you have a whole culture of cynicism, which even ordinary people in northern Nigeria who are Muslim more of them have died in this, in the last few years than even Christians. So what we're dealing with is an existential threat to the unity of the country itself. The Bishops' Conference, of course, we market hope, so we continue to look on the bright side and encourage our people to look a bit more closely about the opportunities that, that we still have. And so this is really where we are now.
Okay, thank you. Rita, tell us how USAID is able to work to alleviate the burden of displacement in the Middle East, and any lessons that you may be able to point out for the Nigeria situation, which is also suffering from huge numbers of displacement.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Nina, and thank you, dear panelists, for this opportunity. I want to say when ISIS took over Iraq, it was really unprecedented, and it was a situation that used indiscriminate violence. And while no one could have accounted for that, our response was very swift and comprehensive, working with allies in the US government and international allies. USAID assistance came to the refugees in Iraq and the internally displaced individuals with humanitarian assistance right away. Then we were able to provide cash assistance, food supplies, and cash for work opportunities. Just recently, my account in the last 2 years, for up to 50,000 people. Now, the amount that we've spent in Iraq since ISIS is on the religious and ethnic minorities has been about over $500 million. And beyond humanitarian assistance, we provided an infrastructure rehabilitation, preventive and mental health services, but we also provided economic opportunities and development assistance. Again, just in the last 2 years, we were able to support 6,000 female-headed households and 4,000 small businesses get back on their feet, and these are all minority businesses. We continue to work on peace building and to prevent future conflicts and support the return of a displaced population in the Nineveh Plains and Western Nineveh, and most of whom are religious minorities, of course. And I'm proud to say that even during COVID, we were able to achieve a peace agreement in the Tel Afar Covenant agreement between Sunni and Shia and the Turkmen. So our work continue, and absolutely there's so much to do in the aftermath of atrocities.
Commissioner, tell us about USCIRF's work to help religious minorities, or recommendations that you have made to the Biden administration to help.
Thank you, and it's really a pleasure to be here with past commissioners and a number of our present commissioners and staff of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. We were created in 1998 through the International Religious Freedom Act, and one of the things that IRFA has really guided us to do is to have a very rich history of advocating on behalf of those refugees who are fleeing religious persecution around the world. We recently had a hearing that was on refugees fleeing religious persecution and made recommendations to the Biden administration on how the U.S. government can better support refugees and asylum seekers. We have been encouraged by recent efforts by the administration to open America's doors to more refugees, including those fleeing religious persecution. As many of you know, President Biden signed a presidential determination in April to revise and reallocate the countries and regions from which the United States would accept refugees in the current fiscal year and up the number to 62,500 and then up the number in subsequent years to 125,000 plus. And as IRFA sort of advocates and provides for, religious persecution should be taken into account when we're looking at what the refugee ceiling is. And it's something that we have continued to urge the Biden administration to do. I think it's important. It was unfortunate at best that in prior years, some of the places in the world that we have seen some of the worst religious persecution were places where the United States closed its doors and that we're seeing those doors open up again. So one of the things that we want to advocate for is not only for refugees around the world, but for the continued implementation of the Lautenberg Amendment, which is an amendment and a special program for ensuring that certain persecuted religious groups from Iran can seek refugee status in the United States. There are currently 80 Iranians remaining in Austria who have been waiting to come to the United States. That is a small part of obviously refugees around the world who have been waiting as well. And so we also have spent a lot of time looking at the expedited removal process, which is whether or not the treatment of those who have come to our borders seeking asylum comports with the United States obligations to support refugees. And we've issued reports, a number of reports on expedited removal. Most of the flaws that we've seen in the expedited removal process are ones that linger and continue. And so we really urge the Biden administration to make sure that there's not an erroneous return of asylum seekers to countries where they could continue to face persecution and torture, and something that could be exacerbated, and certainly was exacerbated when expedited removal was at the levels it has been in recent years. So we're excited to know that there's going to be executive order really asking for there to be a review of the expedited removal process, and it's one where we want to make sure those who are fleeing religious persecution are part of that conversation and the ways in which that process is improved.
Thank you. Back to you, Bishop. Nigeria has about 2 million displaced persons from mainly in the northeast area from Boko Haram and other terror groups. So 2 weeks ago, the Nigerian press ran an article reporting that IDPs, the internally displaced, were forced to live along with the de-radicalized former Boko Haram militants in government camps in Borno, even though the conflict is still ongoing, and still suffering from the trauma of the massacre of their husbands and brothers, maybe their own rapes, the burning of their villages. They had to face their tormentors every day. They have to face them. Some weren't de-radicalized and rejoined Boko Haram even. How can the churches and other faith-based groups help this situation?
Well, thank you very much. I think perhaps some of your data may be based on, maybe a bit old, in part because after the Northeast, in the last 3 years or so, the violence has spread across to North Central, to Northwestern Nigeria, and to Southern Nigeria. So obviously the refugee figures or IDP figures are much higher than that. But for us as church, I think it's important to underscore the fact that we were there even before the modern state emerged. And we've been there with the people, whether it's education, whether it's health services. These are signature tools of the Catholic Church. I can speak for the Catholic Church rather authoritatively. And to say that, and I think this is why I'm very happy that you say this here, we need a seat at the table if we are really going to reach our people. Those giving out the money from government to workers know that a lot of the money going to developing countries, especially post-conflict countries, are largely stolen, and they never reach the people. And I think what is most critical for us now is to begin to think about tomorrow. There's very little we can do about the past, but I think we can shape tomorrow. And in my view, there are 3 quick points I would like to make. The first, for example, is if we're looking at how Boko Haram has destroyed the foundations of our society, we must also accept that educating a new group of young people is important for shaping the future. Right now, there are a total of about 15, 16 million young Nigerians who are moving around the streets and not in school. The abduction of school children has not only created a completely different sense of what education is for children, it has also made it very difficult even for those who are not in school to think very clearly that perhaps Boko Haram must be celebrating. So I make the point that perhaps even if by way of scholarships and so on, we need education. For me is the most fundamental tool for integration. And I live in Sokoto, and the Christian population in Sokoto is barely 2%. Sokoto is the Vatican of the Muslim community. We are running, even with the little resources we have, we're running the best schools. So if we can get the kind of support that can enable us to begin to train a new generation of Nigerians by equipping them with education, then we will be able to close, the tragic gap of religious persecution, the feeling that we are not citizens, but we are Christians and we are Muslims, because we're all dying together. So I think that there is need for us to have a seat at the table so that this conversation can be in such a way that helps to guarantee a very stable Nigeria in future.
Rita, tell us briefly how USAID can help or helps protect religiously persecuted minorities who are displaced. And if so, how does USAID partner with local faith-based organizations to help protect vulnerable displaced religious minorities and others, vulnerable people?
Thank you, Nina. Working with faith-based organizations is monumental and very important. We learned from working in the region, in the Middle East region, that faith-based organizations are trusted. They have credible voices with the communities, but need some professional development, which we have been working on, especially in countries like Lebanon. I'm glad to share with you that our recent project, Baladi CAP, we trained 14 different faith-based organizations that ended up benefiting about 2,000 people in providing social services and economic development. We are also working with faith-based organizations in other countries like Morocco, where we are partnering with Jewish cultural heritage sites. We're partnering with the American Sephardic Federation and Association Mimuna to revive cultural heritage sites. Also, definitely in Syria, Egypt, Iraq, our work continues there. Now, in particular, protecting the religious minorities, I want to highlight the work we're doing in Iraq with the Ankawa Humanitarian Committee of the Chaldean Archdiocese of Erbil to strengthen the ability to deliver relief services to internally displaced individuals and to help them by building the capacity of organizational management, tailored skills for supporting the vulnerable populations. So our work is throughout the Middle East and also in the world, and we find great partnership with faith-based organizations.
Okay. Commissioner Bhargava, you visited Burma and even Bangladesh camps to explore and investigate what was happening to the Rohingya Muslim population who were displaced. And what do you want us to know about that?
So I will underscore what you just heard from Weiwei Nu, who has been a great partner to USERF in really advocating for what's happening to the Rohingya around the world, and particularly those who were driven out of the country in such brutal ways in 2017. We are coming up on the 4th year of there being nearly over 700,000 people who are restricted movement, lack of education, inability to work, and who are sitting in the middle of Bangladesh, and in a time where it is not a refugee resettlement problem, in part because it would be impossible to think about how we could resettle 1 million people, right? And so when we think about that, we have to think about what it is that we need to do to hold Burma accountable for what it is that has taken place. Obviously, there was a military coup in February that we all know about, and that military coup was undertaken by the very groups and individuals who perpetrated the genocide against the Rohingya to begin with. And so, to think about ability to return, and I want to say one thing about that, which is a lot of it has been an argument about who is a citizen of Burma and who has who is part of the polity, and in many ways Burma has that information. It knows who its citizens are, and so the idea that you would ask people who have been driven out of their homes in the middle of the night to evidence the fact that they're part of a country that they had been a part of for generations, they have that information, and it's a question of whether they even acknowledge the existence of people who have lived there for generations. And so it is important that through the Burma Human Rights and Freedom Act, through the continuing push to make sure that there's a genocide determination for the Rohingya, that is something, and that is advocated for and gives some of what we need in terms of underscoring of the importance of the work that's being done in international tribunals to hold Burma accountable and to make sure that we don't buy the idea of a military that has driven people out, suggesting at this point, when they want credibility with the world, that they're going to welcome the Rohingya back. It's not a question of return, it's a question of safe return, and it's a question of return with dignity and the worth and the value that so many that we had a chance to meet with in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh conveyed so gracefully and forcefully to us. And so I think for us, as it is the case with refugees around the world, It is an enormous, as we all know, an enormous crisis in terms of the numbers of refugees we're seeing, and in the places in which we can find ways to hold those who have driven people out accountable. I think that has got to be part of the process, because it is not a situation in which we're going to be able to. I certainly would encourage the United States and other places to welcome the Rohingya, and to the extent that we have, I applaud that. But we certainly need to take other steps to address what's going on there.
Okay, I think we have about 30 seconds left, but Rita, I want to ask you that what does USAID do to prevent refugees and displaced from forming in the first place? You have atrocity prevention programs. Can you just say something very brief about that?
Absolutely. You know, atrocities don't just happen out of the blue. We see things that build up, although towards the end they go quickly. And these things often are unnoticed. While we cannot prevent atrocities, we work with local organizations to kind of mitigate the impact of any effect on minorities. And this is where we found through our work to be very important and very useful, the ability to act quickly and locally.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a wrap.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Which way do we exit?
Once again, Pam Pryor.
Lunch. I promise, soon lunch. You know, every human being is fearfully and wonderfully made. And protecting the least of these, the vulnerable, is a common theme in religious writings. If you want to be part of establishing a global watch group made up of representatives of all faith communities who could report on and respond to religious-inspired violence, then sign up to lead, join, or follow this global campaign. Text "End Violence" to 844-403-2291. It's the same number every time. End violence. Okay? Thank you so much.
Welcome back, Summit Co-Chair Katrina Lantos Sweat.
Well, what a morning it has been. We have been inspired and touched and educated and uplifted. And I have some very exciting news, which is that lunch is just around the corner. So your patience is deeply appreciated, and I hope, although a good meal awaits, I hope that you feel you have been well fed. I want to let you know that breakout sessions, which will be taking place after lunch, will be beginning at 1:45, and at 3:15 we're going to reconvene here for the second plenary. Now, in advance of this fabulous summit, Ambassador Brownback and I were frequently asked, maybe some of you were frequently asked, why religious freedom? Why is it important that we focus on defending religious freedom as opposed to just sort of rolling it into that broader world of human rights causes? I think you have heard some pretty powerful answers to that question today. I hope they are felt deep in your heart, but I'd like to suggest sort of one more thought to take with you, and I'm going to use an analogy to do it. I am not a mathematician. I will never be a mathematician. In fact, it's absolutely the weak link in my intellectual repertoire. But I have enormous admiration for those brilliant minds that can fill multiple blackboards with these immense equations that have symbols and things that I've never even encountered. I will never, ever be able to solve one of those equations, but I know enough of logic and I know enough of reason to understand that if they make a mistake early on one of those blackboards, it doesn't matter how long and how diligently they work on the rest of the equation, the sum will never come right until they go back and fix that problem. To me, respect and defense of freedom of religion, conscience, and belief is sort of the first piece of the human rights equation. It is the foundational piece. And none of the rest of it will ever come right if that peace isn't in place. And that's why it is so important that we fight for this cause, and we are so grateful and so inspired to have you in this fight with us. Religious freedom for everyone, everywhere, all the time. It's our mission, it's our calling, and with your help, we'll bring it to pass. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you back for the second plenary later this afternoon.
This concludes this morning's program. We ask that you promptly leave the ballroom so that staff may clear and reset. This concludes this morning's program. We ask that you promptly leave the ballroom so that staff may clear and reset.